The wind had teeth, and it was biting at the world. It tore through the pines with a hollow scream, ripping snow from the boughs and hurling it into the gray, churning chaos of the blizzard. A man moved through it, a figure of dark wool and grim purpose, his face shielded by a low-brimmed hat caked in ice. His name was Silas, and he knew the language of such storms. He knew their fury was impartial, but their consequences were not. He was heading for the shelter of his cabin, a small, defiant fist of logs clenched against the vast, white poem of the mountainside. He had firewood to last a week, salted meat, and a silence he had cultivated for years. It was all he needed. Then he saw it. A smudge of color against the white, a thing that did not belong. He stopped, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. He squinted, the wind trying to steal the tears from his eyes before they could form. It was a woman. She was stumbling, her body a frail question mark against the howling exclamation of the storm. In her arms, she clutched a bundle. No, 2 bundles. One was strapped to her chest, the other held in the crook of her arm. She fell to her knees, a marionette with its strings cut, her head bowed in exhaustion. Silas did not call out. A shout would be eaten by the wind. He moved toward her, his long strides eating the distance. His boots crunched in the deep snow, a sound that was somehow louder than the gale. As he drew closer, he saw the desperation etched onto her face, a mask of cold and fear. Her lips were blue. The bundles in her arms were babies, wrapped tight, their faces mercifully hidden from the biting air. She looked up as his shadow fell over her eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. She expected a wolf or something worse. She got a man whose face was a landscape of old sorrows, his eyes holding no warmth, but no malice either. He simply looked at her, at the children, his gaze taking in the impossible reality of their situation. He knelt, his movements economical, his presence a sudden, heavy stillness in the swirling snow. He reached out, not for her, but to adjust the blanket over the baby in her arm, tucking it more securely against the cold. His gloved fingers were deft, sure. He looked from the children back to her face. Her breathing was a ragged, shallow thing. She would not last another 10 minutes out here. Neither would they. He stood, a stark silhouette against the fury. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had come from or where she was going. Such questions were luxuries for a world with time and warmth. This world had neither. He spoke, his voice low and rough. Not a shout, but a command that cut through the wind's roar. "You're coming with me," he told the widow carrying 2 babies through the storm. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as absolute and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath them. She stared at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, warring with the overwhelming exhaustion. But she saw in his face not a predator, but a grim sort of deliverance. She had no strength left to argue, no will left to refuse. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He bent, and, with an ease that belied her weight and the heavy bundle on her chest, he lifted her to her feet. He took the second baby from her arm, cradling it against his own broad chest. The child was impossibly light. He turned and began to walk back the way he came, his steps sure and steady. She followed in his wake, the path he broke through the deep snow, the only thing keeping her from collapsing again. The storm howled around them, a beast trying to reclaim them, but the man did not falter. He was a rock, and she was the desperate flotsam clinging to him in the tempest. The cabin was more of a scar than a building, hunkered low against a granite outcrop that broke the worst of the wind. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a pale gray thread stitching it to the iron-colored sky. Silas pushed the heavy plank door open, and a wave of blessedly warm, dry air washed over them. He stepped inside and held the door for her, his eyes urging her forward. Elara, though he did not know her name, hesitated for a breath on the threshold, the instinct of caution battling the instinct for survival. The small, single room was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, something like loneliness. But it was shelter. It was life. She crossed the threshold, and the world of the storm was shut out as Silas barred the door behind them. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the ragged sound of her own breathing. He took the baby from his chest and laid it gently on the thick bearskin rug near the fire. He then helped her unstrap the other infant, his movements impersonal and efficient. Two tiny, red-faced babies lay side by side, blinking in the sudden warmth. They were alive. Silas moved to the fire, adding another log from the stack beside the hearth. The flames leaped, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls. He did not speak. He moved about the small space with a quiet familiarity, hanging his wet hat and coat on a wooden peg, his attention already elsewhere. Elara stood frozen, dripping water onto the floorboards, clutching her own thin, soaked shawl around her shoulders. She watched him, this stranger. He was tall and broad, his silence as imposing as his frame. He moved with a kind of contained energy, a stillness in his motion. She catalogued every detail of the room, looking for signs of who he was, looking for threats. A rifle rested on a rack above the fireplace. A hunting knife in a sheath lay on a small table next to a half-carved piece of wood. A single cot was pushed against the far wall. This was the home of a man who lived alone and was comfortable with it. He turned from the fire, and his eyes met hers. She flinched, expecting an order, a demand. Instead, he gestured with his chin toward the cot. "Your bed," he said. His voice was gravelly from disuse. He then pointed to a heavy wool blanket folded at its foot. "It dry." It was not a suggestion. He turned his back to her, a deliberate offering of privacy, and began checking on the infants, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he felt their feet for warmth. Elara retreated to the cot, her back pressed against the cold logs of the wall. She shed her wet shawl and cloak, her fingers numb and clumsy. She wrapped the thick, dry blanket around herself, the wool coarse against her skin. It smelled faintly of him, of pine and cold air. She sat on the edge of the cot, pulling her knees to her chest, never taking her eyes off him. The babies began to fuss, their small cries thin and fragile in the heavy silence of the cabin. She made to stand, but he was already there. He had heated a small pot of water by the fire and was testing it with his finger. He dipped a clean rag in the warm water and began to gently wipe the infants' faces. He did not coo at them or offer soft words. He simply tended to their needs with a focused, solemn duty. He was a man who communicated through action. His silence was not empty. It was weighted. Elara watched him, this quiet, capable man who had pulled her and her children from the jaws of death, and a new kind of fear began to settle in her heart. It was not the fear of violence, but the fear of the unknown. She knew how to survive cruelty. She did not know what to do with this strange, somber kindness. For 3 days, the storm was a warden, locking them inside the small cabin. The world outside was a roaring white void. Inside, the world was measured by the crackle of the fire, the rhythm of a rocking cradle Silas had fashioned from a packing crate, and the vast, unending ocean of silence between the man and the woman. The silence was a third person in the room, a guest that sat at the small table and watched them. It was a language they both understood, born of different sorrows, but speaking the same tongue of caution. Elara's life had been loud with threats and coarse demands. This quiet was a wilderness she didn't know how to navigate. She kept to her side of the room, tending to the twins, Caleb and Anna. She watched Silas. She learned his routines. He rose before the light, stoked the fire, and went out to check on the small lean-to where a single horse was sheltered. He would return with firewood, his shoulders dusted with snow, his face impassive. He mended things. He sharpened his knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape a counterpoint to the wind. He stitched a tear in his leather boot with an awl and thread, his large hands working with an almost delicate precision. He never spoke unless a word was necessary. "Water," he'd say, placing a fresh bucket by the hearth. "More wood," he'd state, adding logs to the dwindling pile. His actions were his sentences. He built a sturdier shelter. He provided for them. He protected them. On the third day, Anna began to cry, a high, inconsolable wail that filled the cabin. Elara rocked her, paced with her, offered her what little comfort she could, but the crying persisted. It was the fretful, painful cry of a child whose world had been upended. Silas, who had been carving a piece of pine by the fire, stopped. He watched her for a moment, his face unreadable. He put down his knife and the piece of wood and walked over to the hearth. He returned not with a suggestion or a word, but with a small, smooth object in his palm. He held it out to Elara. It was a bird, carved from a lighter wood, its wings half spread, its surface polished by the work of his thumb. It was simple and beautiful. She looked from the bird to his face, confused. He gave a slight nod toward the crying child. Hesitantly, she took the wooden bird and dangled it in front of Anna. The baby's cries faltered. Her small, tear-filled eyes fixed on the object, her tiny hand reaching out to grasp it. Her wails subsided into soft, curious gurgles. Elara looked at Silas, a question in her eyes. He had already returned to his seat by the fire, his back to her, his knife once again still. He had not done it for thanks. He had done it to restore the quiet. Or perhaps for another reason entirely. Later that evening, as the fire burned low and the twins slept soundly, the silence felt different. It was less tense, more settled. "Silas," she said, her voice soft, tentative. It was the first time she had spoken his name, having heard him mutter it once when calming his horse. He looked up from the harness he was mending. He didn't speak, but his eyes acknowledged her. "My name is Elara," she said. "The children are Caleb and Anna." He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a formal introduction in a world stripped of all formality. It was an acknowledgment that they were no longer just a man and a woman, but two people with names, with histories. He went back to his mending. She went back to watching the children sleep, but something had shifted. A single thread of connection had been woven into the fabric of their shared silence. The storm broke on the fourth morning. It did not end with grace, but simply collapsed from its own exhaustion. The wind died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Sunlight, thin and pale, seeped through the single window, illuminating a world transformed. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The light gave Elara a courage she hadn't felt in the roaring dark. She found Silas outside, clearing a path from the cabin door to the lean-to, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, the scrape and crunch of his shovel the only sound in the valley. She stood in the doorway, the cold air sharp on her face, and watched him. He was a part of this landscape, rugged and enduring. He seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the mountains. That afternoon, while the twins slept in the unaccustomed sunlight slanting across the floor, she spoke again. The words came hesitantly at first, like a stream thawing after a long freeze. She told him about her husband, Thomas, a good man taken by a fever that winter. She told him about the farm, a small plot of land they had worked with their own hands, a place of hope. Then her voice grew tighter, harder. She spoke of Jedediah, Thomas's older brother, a man with cold eyes and a greedy heart. He said the farm was his now, she said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. He said the law of the family meant the widow and children went with the property, that I was his to marry. The ugliness of the words hung in the air. This was the threat she had fled. Not just poverty, but a form of slavery, a life under the thumb of a man who saw her as a chattel to be claimed. She had waited for the worst storm of the season, knowing it was her only chance. Jedediah and his men were hard, but they were not foolish enough to track her in a blizzard. She had packed what little she could, taken her babies, and walked into the white mouth of the storm, choosing the possibility of a clean death over the certainty of a living one. She didn't look at Silas as she spoke. She couldn't bear to see pity in his eyes, or worse, judgment. She finished her story, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her confession. She waited for him to speak, to say something, to tell her she was a fool, or that she should go back, or that she couldn't stay here. He did none of those things. After a long moment, he simply rose from his chair, took his axe from beside the door, and went outside. She watched him through the window. He walked to a stand of young aspen at the edge of the clearing and began to fell a tree. The sound of the axe bites echoed in the still, cold air. Sharp, steady, and purposeful. He was not chopping firewood. He was building something. He was answering her story, not with words of comfort, which he did not possess, but with the only language he knew. He was answering with work, with action. He was mending the broken world with the swing of an axe, reinforcing the fragile walls of her safety. He was telling her, without a single word, that she had been right to run, and that here the running could stop. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became a workshop of unspoken promises. Silas's response to Elara's story was not a conversation, but a construction. He used the aspen he had felled to build a proper cradle, one large enough for two, that could be rocked with the touch of a foot. He worked on it in the evenings by the firelight, the scrape of his drawknife a soothing, rhythmic sound. Elara would watch him, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large hands shaping the wood with an artisan's care. He was not just building a cradle. He was building a sanctuary. He spent his days hunting, returning with rabbit or deer slung over his shoulder, ensuring their small larder was always full. He reinforced the door, fitting a new, stronger latch. He repaired a loose stone in the chimney. Each action was a brick in a wall he was building around them, a fortress of quiet diligence. Elara, in turn, began to reclaim the space. She had arrived as a refugee, a guest at the mercy of her host. But as she saw his silent commitment, she began to see the cabin not as his, but as theirs. She found a stash of old flour and yeast and baked bread, filling the small room with a scent that was warm and alive, a scent of home. It was a stark contrast to the cold, lonely smell of bachelorhood that had first greeted her. She took one of Silas's old torn shirts, and with a needle and thread she found in a dusty tin, she mended it. When he came in from the cold, she had it folded and waiting for him on his chair. He picked it up, looked at the neat stitches, then looked at her. His nod was barely perceptible, but it was laden with a meaning that words would have cheapened. She began to transform the stark functionality of the cabin. She washed the single window until it gleamed, letting in every precious ray of winter sun. She bundled dried mountain herbs she found hanging from the rafters and placed them near the hearth, adding a clean, sharp fragrance to the air. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. It was a partnership forged in silence and mutual need. They were two solitary creatures learning to share a den. He would bring in a bucket of water and leave it by the fire to warm for the baby's washing. She would have a hot meal ready for him when he returned from a day of checking his trap lines. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate. The snow is deep to the north. Caleb has a tooth coming in. But their shared tasks became a conversation. The way he stacked the firewood for her to easily reach was a line of dialogue. The way she saved him the best piece of meat was a reply. They were creating a life, not with vows or declarations, but with the quiet, steady accumulation of small, considerate acts. One evening, as she rocked the cradle, she began to hum a soft, forgotten lullaby. Silas, who was cleaning his rifle, paused. He did not look at her, but he stopped his work and listened until she was finished. In the resonant silence that followed, they both understood that something fragile and precious was taking root in the frozen ground of their solitude. The world was beginning to thaw. Patches of bare earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes, dark and promising against the shrinking snow. The days grew longer. With the change in season came a change in the air, a sense of possibility. But it also brought a new kind of dread. The melting snow meant the mountain passes would soon be open. The isolation that had been their shield was dissolving with the ice. One afternoon, Silas was high on the ridge behind the cabin, checking for signs of game. His eyes, trained to spot the twitch of a deer's ear 100 yards away, caught something else. A flicker of movement in the valley below. It was a man on horseback, far enough away to be a mere speck, but his purpose was clear. He was not traveling through. He was scouting. He moved slowly along the base of the mountains, his head turning from side to side, scanning the tree line. Silas dropped to one knee behind a tangle of juniper, his body instantly still. The cabin was nestled well, invisible from the valley floor to an undiscerning eye. But Jedediah was not undiscerning. He was a hunter of a different sort. Silas watched until the rider, having completed his pass, turned his horse and retreated the way he had come. He had not seen them, not today. Silas returned to the cabin as dusk was settling. Elara knew the moment he walked through the door that something was wrong. His silence, usually a calm and steady presence, was now sharp-edged. It was the silence of a man listening for a threat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't answer immediately. He went to the rifle rack above the fireplace, took down his weapon, and began the familiar, methodical process of cleaning it, though it was already spotless. He laid out the cleaning rod, the patches, the oil. The small, deliberate movements were a way of ordering his thoughts. "A rider," he said finally, his eyes focused on his work. "In the valley." Elara felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She didn't have to ask who it was, or who he worked for. She walked to the window and stared out into the gathering twilight as if she could see the threat herself. The piece they had so carefully constructed felt paper-thin, a fragile pane of glass about to be shattered. "He didn't see the cabin," Silas continued, his voice flat. "The location is good, but they're looking." The word hung in the air, plural and menacing. It was not just Jedediah. It was a pack. Elara turned from the window. Her face was pale, but her eyes were not filled with the panicked fear she had worn in the storm. This was a different look. It was the grim resolve of a mother protecting her young. She looked at Silas, at the rifle in his hands, at the determined set of his jaw. She looked at her sleeping children. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. "What do we do?" she asked. It was the first time she had used the word "we" in such a way. It was an acknowledgment of their shared fate, their shared fight. Silas stopped his work and looked at her. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "We wait," he said. And in his voice she did not hear resignation. She heard readiness. The presence of the distant rider unsettled the dust of Silas's own past. That night, sleep would not come. He sat by the fire, long after Elara and the children had retired to the cot he had given over to them. The flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, and in the flickering light, old ghosts stirred. The cabin was quiet, but his mind was loud with the echoes of another life, another failure. Elara, sensing his wakefulness, rose from the bed. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and came to sit in the other chair by the hearth, leaving a respectful distance between them. She did not speak, but her presence was a quiet question. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the embers glow and fade. Then Silas spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough with emotions he kept perpetually buried. "They were men like him," he began, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Greedy, saw a piece of land they wanted. My land." Elara listened, her posture still, her attention absolute. She knew he was not just talking about land. "I had a wife," he said, the words costing him more than any physical labor. "Sarah, and a boy. Matthew. He was 5. He paused, and in that pause lay a chasm of grief a decade wide. They came with papers they said were legal, said the railroad had a claim. It was a lie, but they had the law in their pocket and guns in their hands. I told them to leave." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "I thought I could reason with them. I thought being right was enough. It wasn't." His voice dropped, becoming almost inaudible. "I was away, selling pelts in town. I was gone 3 days. When I came back, ... He stopped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The scorched silence said everything. The fire, the smoke, the emptiness. He had lost everything not in a fair fight, but to the casual cruelty of men who take what they want simply because they can. "I hunted them," he said, his voice now stripped of all emotion, flat and cold as a river stone. "It took a year. I found all 3 of them, and I did what the law wouldn't." He looked up from the fire then, and his eyes met Elara's. She saw in them not the pride of vengeance, but the hollow emptiness of it. It had not brought his family back. It had only deepened his solitude. "I couldn't protect them," he said, the core of his pain finally laid bare. "My son, my wife." That was the reason for his silence, for his isolation. It was a penance. He had built this solitary life as a monument to his failure. Elara saw it all then. His fierce, immediate protection of her and the twins was not just charity. It was a chance in his mind to answer for the past. He was not just protecting her from Jedediah. He was fighting the ghosts of the men who had destroyed his world. She reached across the space between them, and for the first time laid her hand on his arm. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it was an anchor in the storm of his memory. "You are protecting us," she said softly. Her words were not absolution, but they were a statement of a present truth. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. In her eyes, he did not see judgment or pity. He saw understanding. He saw a resilience that mirrored his own. And for the first time in 10 years, the crushing weight on his soul felt just a little bit lighter. Spring arrived in earnest, washing the valley in shades of green and gold. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new pine growth. The menace of the distant rider faded with the last of the snow, replaced by the pressing, immediate needs of life. A truce of peace settled over the small cabin, a period of grace they both knew was borrowed. They worked side by side, their quiet partnership now an ingrained habit. Silas taught her the ways of the mountains. He showed her how to read tracks in the soft mud, how to tell the difference between the print of a wolf and a dog. He taught her how to set a snare, his large hands guiding her smaller ones with a surprising patience. She was a quick study, her attention sharp, her memory long. In return, she brought a different kind of life to the homestead. With a spade he had forged for her from a broken shovelhead, she tilled a small patch of earth near the cabin, a defiant square of civilization in the wild. She planted the few precious seeds she had carried with her beans and squash, and tended to the small garden with a fierce devotion. It was a promise of a future, a statement that they intended to be here when the harvest came. The children thrived. They grew fat on rabbit stew and the milk of a stray goat that Silas had managed to catch and domesticate. They spent their days on a blanket in the sun, their gurgles and coos the new soundtrack of the valley. Caleb, the more adventurous of the two, was already trying to crawl. Anna, the watcher, would follow Silas with her eyes whenever he was near. One afternoon, Silas returned from the woods to find Elara laughing. It was a sound he had never heard before, a soft, genuine burst of joy. She was on her knees in her small garden, and Caleb, who had managed to crawl off his blanket, had a fistful of dirt and was trying to eat it. The sight of her unbridled happiness stopped Silas in his tracks. He watched for a moment, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. She looked up and saw him, and her laughter subsided into a warm smile. "He has an appetite for the land," she said. Silas grunted, a sound that was almost a chuckle. He walked over and effortlessly plucked the boy from the dirt. He held Caleb up, looking at the child's dirt-smeared face with a solemnity that was his version of affection. "Needs more salt," he said, his tone deadpan. Elara's smile widened. It was the closest to a joke he had ever made. The found family was no longer a temporary arrangement of survival. It was real. It had a rhythm, a feel, a life of its own. He was the silent, steady protector. She was the resilient heart of the home. The children were the future they were both fighting for. Later, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat outside the cabin, watching the colors fade. The children slept inside. A comfortable silence settled between them. It was no longer the silence of caution or grief. It was the silence of contentment, of two people who understood each other without the need for words. It was the calm before the storm, a perfect, fragile moment of peace they would both remember when the world came to tear it all down. The peace was broken by the barking of the dog. Not their goat, but a real dog, sharp and aggressive. It was a sound that did not belong in their quiet valley. Silas was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He moved to the edge of the trees, peering down the path. Elara rushed inside, barring the door and gathering the children into the cradle in the farthest, most protected corner of the room. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she saw them. 4 riders emerging from the trees. The man in the lead was stout and well-dressed for the trail, his face florid with anger and arrogance. Jedediah. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his men fanning out behind him, their expressions a mixture of smugness and contempt. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to take. Elara. Jedediah's voice was oily and loud, a violation of the valley's stillness. "You've had your little adventure. Time to come home. Bring my brother's sons." He spoke as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if her will was an irrelevant triviality. He scanned the clearing, his eyes dismissing the small garden, the neatly stacked firewood. His gaze settled on the cabin door. "I know you're in there. Don't make this difficult." Silas stepped out from the tree line, not from the cabin. He appeared as if from the earth itself, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He positioned himself between the riders and the cabin, a silent, immovable obstacle. Jedediah's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. He had expected a frightened woman, not this. "And who might you be?" he sneered. "Her new protector?" "This is my land," Silas said, his voice calm and low, yet it carried in the still air. "You're trespassing." "Your land?" Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This woman and her children are my property, by law and by blood. I'm here to collect what's mine. Step aside, or we'll step over you." One of his men, a lanky man with a cruel mouth, unholstered his pistol, letting it rest on his thigh. A clear threat. "She is not property," Silas stated. The words were simple, declarative, and absolute. "And she is not yours to claim. Turn your horses and ride out of this valley." Jedediah's face purpled with rage. He was not used to being defied. He saw the world in terms of owners and the owned, the strong and the weak. This quiet man with the rifle was an unacceptable complication to his simple, brutal arithmetic. "I gave you a choice," Jedediah snarled, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "You chose poorly." Inside, Elara watched, her knuckles white around the iron poker. She saw the set of Silas's shoulders, the calm in his stance. He was not afraid. He was ready. She looked at her sleeping babies, and her own fear burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. This was her home. These were her children. And that man outside, the silent stranger who had become their shield, he was her family. She would not let them be taken. The valley held its breath, the air thick with the promise of violence. The final, fragile moment of peace had shattered. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and motion. Jedediah went for his gun, but Silas was faster. He was not a man who drew in a flashy duel. He was a man who shot to end a threat. The rifle was at his shoulder in a single fluid motion. The crack of the shot echoed off the mountainside, sharp and definitive. Jedediah grunted, a look of shocked betrayal on his face, as he clutched a blossoming red stain on his shoulder and toppled from his horse. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. The other 3 men reacted, a chaotic scramble of drawn pistols and panicked shouts. The lanky man fired wild, the bullet thudding into a pine tree near Silas's head, spraying bark. Silas had already dropped to one knee, working the lever action of his rifle, another brass casing ejecting into the dirt. He was not flustered. His movements were economical, his focus absolute. This was a grim task he had performed before. He fired again. The lanky man jerked backward, his pistol flying from his hand, and fell still. The other 2 were smarter. One spurred his horse directly at Silas, hoping to trample him while the other swung wide to get a clear shot at his flank. Silas ignored the charging horseman, his attention fixed on the circling threat. He fired his 3rd shot, and the flanking rider slumped over his horse's neck. The charging horse was almost on him. Silas didn't try to reload. He dropped the rifle and drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt. As the horse reared up, hooves flailing, he rolled sideways, coming up inside the rider's reach. The man leaned down, pistol aimed, but Silas was too close. He lunged upward, a blur of motion. It was brutal, intimate, and silent. The rider made a choked, gurgling sound and slid from the saddle, landing in a heap. The horse, terrified, galloped away into the woods. Inside the cabin, Elara had acted. As the first shot rang out, she had shoved a heavy table against the door, then moved to window. She saw the 4th man, Jedediah, staggering to his feet, his face a mask of pain and fury. His good arm was reaching for his fallen pistol. He was focused entirely on Silas, who was still dealing with the horseman. Jedediah was going to shoot him in the back. Without a second thought, Elara seized the kettle of boiling water she always kept on the hearth. She flung open the window shutter, ignoring the risk, and with a desperate cry, she hurled the scalding contents at Jedediah. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the boiling water hit his face and chest. He stumbled blindly, his gun forgotten, clawing at his skin. Silas turned, his knife in hand, and saw the scene. He saw Elara in the window, her face fierce and determined. He saw Jedediah, disarmed and incapacitated. He walked over to the whimpering man, his expression grim. He kicked the pistol away and looked at Jedediah writhing on the ground. He did not kill him. He simply stood over him, a silent, final judgment. The fight was over. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before, broken only by Jedediah's pathetic moans and the frantic chirping of birds returning to the trees. The violence had been sudden, fast, and complete. Dawn broke, spilling cool, clean light over a valley scarred by the previous evening's violence. The air was still and cold. Silas had dealt with the bodies, a grim, solitary task performed in the dark. He had tied the wounded and weeping Jedediah to his own horse and sent it walking back down the trail, a living message to anyone who might think of following. Now he sat at the table in the cabin, his shirt off, while Elara tended to a deep gash on his arm, a parting gift from the rider with the knife. The wound was clean, but it had bled freely. Elara worked with a steady, practiced hand, her touch gentle but firm. She washed the wound with clean water and bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from one of her own petticoats. The roles had been reversed. He, the unbreachable protector, was now the one being cared for. She, the rescued survivor, was now the healer. Her focus was entirely on her task. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not speak of the fight, of the fear, or of the men who now lay in shallow graves on the mountainside. The horror of it was a shared, unspoken knowledge. To give it words would be to give it a power they could not afford. Silas watched her. He watched the way the early morning light caught the stray hairs that had escaped her braid. He watched the careful, efficient movements of her hands. In the storm, he had seen her desperation. In the cabin, he had seen her resilience. In the window, with the kettle in her hands, he had seen her ferocity. He had seen all the pieces of who she was, and he understood that her strength was a match for his own. She finished tying the bandage, and her hands rested for a moment on his arm. She finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. In their depths he saw not a reflection of the violence they had endured, but a quiet, unshakable strength. The terror was gone, replaced by a profound, weary peace. He had not fought for her. They had fought together. "It's done," he said, his voice low and hoarse. It was a statement about more than just the fight. Jedediah was gone. The threat was neutralized. The past was buried. "Yes," she said softly, "it's done." She let her hand fall away and rose to check on the children. Caleb and Anna were stirring in their cradle, their small faces serene, untouched by the darkness that had passed so close to them. They were safe. Elara stood watching them for a long moment, then turned back to Silas. "This is a good place," she said, her gaze sweeping over the small, rough-hewn room that had become their world. It was not a question. It was a declaration. Silas looked from her face to the sleeping children, and then around the cabin that she had transformed from a lonely shelter into a home. He thought of the life he had lost, the long, empty years he had spent in his solitary penance. That life was over. A new one had begun. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Our home," he said. And the word, spoken in his quiet, rumbling voice, sealed the promise they had been building all along, with silent actions, shared meals, and a battle fought side by side. A year passed. Then another. The seasons turned, dressing the valley in the white of winter, the green of spring, the gold of summer, and the fiery reds of autumn. The small cabin was no longer just a cabin. It was a homestead. A new room had been added, built with logs. Silas had felled and squared himself, with Elara helping to daub the mud and moss between them. A sturdy fence, its posts sunk deep, now enclosed the cabin and the garden, a clear line drawn against the wilderness. It was not a fence to keep threats out, but one to keep life in. The garden had expanded, its neat rows producing enough beans, squash, and potatoes to last them through the winters. The goat herd had grown to 3, and their milk kept the children healthy and strong. Caleb and Anna were toddlers now, their laughter a constant presence in the valley that had once known only silence. They were sturdy children, with their mother's dark eyes and Silas's quiet solemnity. They would follow him as he worked, Caleb trying to mimic his father's long strides, Anna clutching a small, worn wooden bird in her fist. They called him Pa, a word that had at first startled him and then settled into his heart like a warm stone. He was no longer just Silas, the man haunted by ghosts. He was a father. Elara was the soul of their small world. She moved with a purpose and a quiet joy that seemed to emanate from her, warming everything she touched. She still had a resilience born of hardship, but it was no longer a shield against the world. It was the foundation upon which their life was built. The silence between them remained, but it had transformed entirely. It was no longer a space of caution or unspoken grief. It was a language of deep, abiding intimacy. It was in the way he'd touch her back as he passed her in the narrow kitchen. It was in the way she'd bring him a cup of water without him needing to ask. It was in the shared glance across the fire at the end of a long day, a glance that held a universe of understanding of shared history, of a love that had never needed to be declared because it was lived every single day. So here ends our story of the man, the woman, and the storm. It began in the heart of a blizzard, with two strangers thrown together by desperation and a single grim command. It found its footing in the quiet spaces, in the building of a cradle and the mending of a shirt. It was sealed in a moment of brutal violence and consecrated in the peaceful dawn that followed. They were two broken people, each fleeing the ghosts of their past. They did not fix each other. Instead, they stood side by side and built something new from the wreckage, a family forged not by blood, but by the deliberate choice to protect, to nurture, and to love. They created a home in the heart of the wilderness, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the quietest places, and the most profound love stories are the ones written not with words, but with actions. Before you go, tell me this. What is it that truly makes a family? Is it the bonds we are born into, or the ones we are brave enough to build for ourselves?